Well, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Pratibha Parmar. So, Pratibha Parmar was born in Nairobi, Kenya. Her family migrated to London, England. She currently spends time between London and California, where she is an associate professor in the film program at the California College of the Arts. A graduate of the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, Parmar co-founded the first Black British women's publishing house, Black Women Talk, as well as being a member of Shiba Feminist Publisher. Parmar published a number of groundbreaking texts on queer of color art, film, and theory practices. Over the decades, Parmar has brought marginalized stories to the mainstream through feature films such as Nina's Heavenly Delights in 2006 and her countless award-winning documentaries, Alice Walker Beauty and Truth in 2013 and A Place of Rage in 1991. Early works like Emergence in 1986, Fresh and Paper, Flesh and Paper in 1990 generated vital visibility for an emerging generation of queer of color activists and contemporary poets, such as Suniti Samjoshi and Audre Lorde, while documentaries like Reframing AIDS and Kush opened key spaces of discussion around queer practices and sexualities in a diasporic context. As an artist, Parmar has brought a queer optic lens to multiple emergent discourses of racialized and gendered otherness, creating much needed links and landscapes of resistance. Her films have received international acclaim, and her dedication in bringing complex subjects into mainstream media has helped change the contours of popular discourse on race, feminism, sexuality, and creativity. Thank you for being with us, Pratibha. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, and everyone else, and Sandeep. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. And I think I'm not seeing the screen, but that, as long as you can see me, that's fine. Yes. First of all, I want to say thank you, as I just did, for this invitation. And also I would like to do a land acknowledgement and acknowledge the original people of the land where I am a guest right now, which is in Berkeley, California, the land of the Ohlone people. So I just want to start off with that land acknowledgement. There's a number of different things that I kind of was thinking about in using this space this morning, but I thought I would, it's morning for me, so it's just, I thought I'd start with a kind of a framing quote in a way from Gramsci, and a quote from his prison notebooks, which kind of I at one time had it typed up and printed up as a way to kind of help me always ground myself in terms of the kind of films that I am making or want to make. And I've sort of thought, I hadn't looked at it for a while, and I thought it would be a useful thing to go back to. So what the quote is, the starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is, and is knowing thyself as a product of the historical processes to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. Therefore, it is imperative at the outset to compile such an inventory. And so I think that in a way, this kind of Gramsci's notion of knowing thyself as the product of historical processes to date is a kind of a foundational premise of my own film and video practice. What I do, how I do it, why I do it is a direct result of the multiple traces deposited in me and on me by histories of migration, experiences of rupture, and forced otherness. My visual output and my written text are in this sense an inventory of stories foregrounding marginalized subjectivities, stories that disrupt and critique hegemonic norms and ideals. And this kind of this sort of project of excavating and illuminating the dialogue and conflict between the politicization of personal experience and the construction of narratives driven by a collective desire and resistance is sort of very much aligned with my own sort of political and creative trajectory. And so yes, you had in the introduction to me, you know that I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, to Indian parents who had grown up under and resisted British colonialism in India. My mother, when she was a young woman before she was married, was at a college in India where I remember her telling me stories of how her and some of the other young women would get up in the middle of the night and go and derail the railway lines on which they had intel that the British troops were coming through. And so this is part of the sort of Gandhian nonviolence movement activism that my mother was very much part of. You know, when we migrated to England when I was 12, and we had to leave Kenya because Kenya got its independence from the British. So, but that independence was not without its bloodshed. Wherever and whenever colonial rulers are forced to leave, we know that they ensure that they leave a trail of blood saturating the earth. The British incarcerated, tortured, and murdered approximately 25,000 Kenyans. More than 1 million Kenyans were detained over 8 years in concentration camps, barbed wire villages where forced labor, starvation, and death were routine. And there's some horrific oral testimonies exist from women who survived the camps of rape and torture. Colonial rulers have always gone where they wanted to and moved the colonized from one colony to another. And this is how my ancestors came to be in East Africa, taken from India to Kenya with promises of wealth and comfort. And the complex web of color class apartheid that the British imposed and pitted one colonized group against another is an archive that is still being excavated. And it's a project that one of the projects that I am working on. After Kenyan independence, Indian communities left en masse to go to the UK because we were, according to my father, these proud possessors of Commonwealth British passports. But we were not welcomed to the motherland, and we arrived to the hostile reception and equally frosty climate. The traces of this disruption at that formative age of 12 live with me to this day and are part of my identity formation. One of the things I'm going to sort of move around a little bit because I don't want to take up too much time. So my filmmaking trajectory began with the intent to filter my experiences as an immigrant British citizen, of mediating my evolving consciousness as a woman of color, a queer woman, and a visual artist. And my visual explorations became a necessary way for me to formulate and give contours to my shifting identities against the kind of hegemonic notions of who I was supposed to be. In defiance of neoliberal state definitions of otherness that demanded submission and exploitation, many of us threw ourselves into multimedia projects that began to dismantle the prevalent dehumanized images with our unique imaginaries that defied easy explanations. One of the, I'd like to show a clip because I feel for me that a lot of my work really speaks more better visually than I do verbally. one of the very first films I made was called Sari Red. And it was just 11 minutes long. At that point, I didn't even know that I was a filmmaker or a video artist or anything. It was just a kind of, I was given a Video 8 camera and said, make a 11-minute or 10-minute film on anything you want. And so the whole film was made by me with a camera, edited by me, written by me. And it was one of those very first kind of explorations of my own language as a visual artist and kind of trying to figure out what that language was. And it was sparked, Sari Red was sparked by an incident that I was deeply affected by. A young woman, Kalbinder Kaur Hair, was I read about her, and I went to the pickets and sort of I guess the vigils that were organized in her memory. But Kalbinder was and two of her friends were walking down the street in London, and as they were just walking along, a white van with the three white men drove alongside them and started to shout racist abuse. And Kalbinder shouted back. That was her instinct, to shout back. And that would be when and for shouting back, the van driver turned the van around, drove onto the pavement and crushed her against the wall. And when I read about this, I was just totally incandescent with rage and sorrow, but also felt that that could have so easily have been me or any number of South Asian women that I know, because we would shout back for our dignity in resistance. So Sari Red is a political and poetical remembering, but it's also about presence of multiple registers of naming and claiming. And with this video, it's only in retrospect, because at the time that I was making it and exploring a visual language, I wasn't conscious of what I was doing until later. And so now in retrospect, I'm able to say that with this video, I was actually making a conscious break with the so-called master codes of cinema by using culturally specific signs and symbols to create like the mise-en-scène of this loss and bereavement, of mourning and grief. And of inscribing a presence, both of a community and a young woman within that community. And so my aim was to also render a presence of the internal spaces of safety, of home as sanctuary, and juxtapose it to the lived reality of the external world. Within the internal world, there is the everyday. I used my family home, my family members, as those potentially under threat, as we would be. How to convey the violence of being crushed against a wall, an evocation of that brutality without resort to naturalism. So Sari Red is an attempt to make Kalbinder Kaur Hair, the young woman who was killed, present on screen, albeit through the violence that she was subjected to. It is also my own imaginative reflections on her short life, for my desire for her life to have mattered, to be named, not to be obliterated into a statistic, not to be erased, but to be present, to be given a voice, and to make a demand of the viewer that we must be witnesses to her life and its brutal ending. And I felt it my task, even duty, to craft her presence and assert the presence of my family and community in this hostile landscape that we found ourselves in. I think this kind of the strategy of naming and asserting a presence are strategies of resistance. Because let's consider the Black Lives Movement in the US and the chant, "Say Her Name." Say Her Name movement is a response to the Black Lives Matter movement and the mainstream media's tendency to sideline the experiences of Black women in the context of police brutality and anti-Black violence. It is a movement that calls attention to police violence against Black women and girls and demands their stories be integrated into calls for justice, policy responses to police violence, and media representations of police brutality. The need and necessity to lift up their stories, our stories, means we need to know who they are, how they lived, and what they suffered at the hands of police or at the hands of racists. Because the connective tissue between them and me, them and us, is set in deep grooves. I did not know Kulbinder Kaur, the young woman killed, but I felt that she was a part of me, or that I could have been her. In this moment of connection between her and myself, I wanted to create what I call a space for visual justice. So I'm going to try and share this 3-minute clip. I'll try and make it short. So here goes. Let's see.
Your blood. Invisible winds carrying words of hatred. This was not the first time. They had heard it before. The voices of hatred, the laughter of hyenas, taking pleasure in our pain, in our blood. It is November the 7th, 1985. 3 young Asian women leave Dartford College. As they stand outside the entrance to the college, a transit van travelling along the opposite side of the road suddenly and deliberately turns towards the 3 friends. Inside the van are 3 white men. Invisible winds carrying words of hatred. Angry at this violation, Kulbinder shouted back. For her dignity and her pride, she shouted back. For her self-respect, she shouted back. For such violation in public, she shouted back. Yes, she shouted back. Indeed, she shouted back. Of course, she shouted back.
So, earlier I spoke to my intention to make this conscious break with the so-called master codes of cinema by using culturally specific signs and symbols to create the mise en scène of this loss and brutality. And I learned the power of this visual resistance vividly when I was invited to, in 1989, I think, to a very supposedly prestigious documentary seminar in the US known as the Flaherty Seminar, after the ethnographic documentarian Robert Flaherty. When I was invited to attend, it was the first time in the long history of this revered seminar that there was more than one person of color who was present and that their work was being shown. After the screening at the seminar of Sari Red, a white male participant made comments to the effect that because he did not understand the visual language of the film, as it was culturally too specific and not universal and not accessible to him, and by implication, it was a failure in his eyes. So it's interesting what happens when we don't use the visual signs and symbols of a dominant colonizing culture, when we begin to decolonize the gaze. I suggested very politely that perhaps it was time for him to learn the signs and symbols of other culture, since we've always had to do the work of translation of visual, dominant visual modes. Well, my comment set off this kind of volcanic eruption that seminar apparently had never seen before. And that I was told, did I not know that this man that I had insulted by suggesting he learn the language of other cultures and learn to decode, he was some major prestigious professor at some major university, and that nobody had ever suggested to him that he had any learning to do. His was not this quiet implication, but a really loud proclamation that we have to assume an entirely white world in order to be universal. That our point of reference should only ever be the self-proclaimed master narrative. And, you know, he did not in any way acknowledge his or question his subject position, because he had never had to do that. And this was the first time that he was having to do that. So I think I want to stop there. I know, Sandeep, you'd want me to share a clip and talk about Kush, but I'm not sure. I didn't keep I didn't keep an eye on the time, so I'm probably taken up quite a bit of my time already. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Pratibha, and thank you for this very generous presentation. And I like this loud proclamation of the person who obviously did not realize who you were, but we all. And I think it beautifully flows from what Aruni was saying, and you know, you've taken up with that. So thank you so much for that.